A 7,000-year-old body with modern features was found. This should not exist, but it does. A human body, buried for over 7,000 years, showing features that belong to people living today. Not similar. Not close. But almost identical. And the deeper scientists looked, the less it made sense. The discovery began quietly, in a remote excavation site where archaeologists expected nothing more than routine findings. Fragments of pottery, tools carved from stone, maybe the remains of early settlements, things that fit neatly into the timeline of human history. But then they found the skeleton. At first, nothing about it seemed extraordinary. The burial position matched known customs. The surrounding artifacts dated it firmly to around 5000 BCE. Everything appeared consistent. Until the analysis began. The skull was the first anomaly. Its structure didn't match what researchers expected from that era. Typically, human remains from 7,000 years ago show slightly different cranial proportions, subtle differences, but enough for trained anthropologists to identify patterns over time. This skull didn't follow those patterns. The bone density, the symmetry, even the jawline, all of it aligned more closely with modern human populations than with ancient ones. It was as if time had skipped forward. At first, the team assumed contamination or misdating. That would have been the simplest explanation. Radiocarbon dating can be affected by environmental factors, and sometimes remains are disturbed over centuries. So they tested again. And again. Each time, the result remained the same. The body was ancient. Undeniably ancient. This is where the problem begins. Because according to everything we understand about human evolution, physical traits develop gradually. Changes accumulate over thousands of years. 7,000 years ago, humans were still transitioning in many regions, adapting to agriculture, forming early societies, and slowly shaping the features we recognize today. But this body didn't show a transition. It showed completion. The official explanation, at least initially, was variation. Humans have always been diverse. Some populations develop traits earlier than others. Genetic drift, environmental pressure, and migration patterns can accelerate certain changes. So perhaps this individual simply belonged to a group that evolved faster in specific ways. It's a reasonable idea. It fits within known science. And for a while, it was enough. But then the DNA results came in. Ancient DNA is fragile. Extracting it is difficult, and interpreting it is even harder. Yet over the past decade, advancements have allowed scientists to reconstruct genetic profiles from remains thousands of years old. When they sequenced the DNA from this body, they expected to see markers typical of early human populations from that region. Instead, they found something unexpected. Certain genetic sequences matched modern populations with striking precision. Not broadly similar, specifically aligned. Traits linked to facial structure, skin composition, even aspects of immune response appeared far more advanced than what should have existed at that time. It was as if this individual carried genetic information that belonged to the future. Now the mystery deepened. Because if the physical features could be dismissed as natural variation, the DNA could not. Genetics follows patterns. It leaves trails. And this trail didn't lead backward, it pointed forward. One theory suggested that our understanding of human timelines might be incomplete. Perhaps modern human traits emerged earlier than we thought, in isolated groups that left little trace behind. These groups could have developed advanced genetic characteristics long before they became widespread. Over time, their influence might have spread through migration and interbreeding, eventually shaping the populations we see today. It's a compelling idea. But it raises a question: if such groups existed, where is the rest of the evidence? Another theory proposed something more unusual. What if this wasn't a case of early development, but preservation? In other words, what if certain genetic traits remained unchanged for thousands of years in specific lineages? Instead of evolving rapidly, they simply stayed the same, waiting to reappear in modern populations. This would suggest a kind of genetic continuity that challenges the way we think about evolution, not as constant change, but as a balance between change and stability. And then there is a third possibility. One that scientists approach carefully, but cannot completely ignore. What if the timeline itself is wrong? Not entirely wrong, but incomplete. Human history is built on fragments. Bones, tools, artifacts, all pieces of a much larger puzzle. And sometimes, a single piece doesn't fit. When that happens, we have two choices: reshape the piece, or reconsider the puzzle. The breakthrough came when researchers compared this DNA to a broader global database. They weren't just looking for similarities, they were searching for patterns. Connections across time and geography. What they found didn't provide answers. It created more questions. The genetic markers in this ancient body didn't just resemble modern humans. In some cases, they were closer to specific populations living today than to any known ancient group. This wasn't gradual evolution. It was alignment across thousands of years. A kind of genetic echo. And then, something even more unexpected emerged. There were sequences in the DNA that didn't match any known category from that time period. Not entirely foreign, but not entirely understood either. These sequences appeared to be stable, functional, and integrated into the genome. They weren't errors. They were part of the individual's biology. Yet their origin remained unclear. This is where the narrative shifts. Because now, the mystery is no longer just about one body. It's about what that body represents. A possibility that human history is not as linear as we believe. That certain traits, certain genetic configurations, may appear, disappear, and reappear across time in ways we don't yet understand. Imagine standing at that excavation site. The ground beneath you holds thousands of years of history. Every layer tells a story. But somewhere in that story, there is a gap. A moment where something changed or didn't change when it should have. And all you have is a single skeleton to guide you. I tried to picture it. This individual, living 7,000 years ago, walking through a world that looked very different from ours. Different landscapes. Different societies. And yet, carrying features that belong to us. Would anyone around them have noticed? Or would they have seemed completely ordinary in their own time? That question matters. Because if they were ordinary, then perhaps the anomaly isn't the individual, but our understanding of the past. The deeper twist lies not in the bones or the DNA, but in the mechanism behind them. Evolution is often described as a forward-moving process. Traits emerge, spread, and define future generations. But what if evolution also works in cycles? What if certain genetic patterns are not lost, but stored, reappearing when conditions allow? This would mean that the modern features we recognize are not entirely new. They may have existed before, in forms we are only now beginning to rediscover. This idea doesn't break science. But it stretches it. Because it suggests that time, in biological terms, is not a straight line. It's a network. And sometimes, that network connects points we never expected. So what does this discovery actually mean? Not that history is wrong. Not that evolution is flawed. But that there are layers we haven't fully uncovered yet. Hidden patterns in our DNA. Forgotten chapters in our past. And individuals, like this one, who don't fit neatly into the story we've been telling. And maybe that's the point. Because the most important discoveries are not the ones that give us answers. They are the ones that force us to ask better questions. And the moment researchers realized they were no longer studying the past, but something that was somehow connected to the present, the entire investigation changed direction. Because up until that point, the goal was simple: understand how this individual fit into human history. But now, a new question emerged. What if this individual didn't just belong to the past, but was somehow linked to people living today in ways no one had ever considered? The next phase of the study became more precise. Instead of looking broadly at human evolution, scientists began comparing the DNA from this ancient body with specific modern populations. Not entire continents, not general regions, but tightly defined genetic groups. The kind used in advanced ancestry tracking and medical research. And that's when something deeply unsettling appeared. There were matches. Not distant similarities. Not vague overlaps. But clear, measurable genetic connections between this 7,000-year-old individual and small groups of people alive right now. The kind of connection that usually suggests shared ancestry, but separated by only a few thousand years, not entire eras of human development. This wasn't supposed to happen. Because according to standard models of genetics, DNA changes over time through mutation, recombination, and environmental adaptation. Even closely related populations drift apart genetically over centuries. But here, the gap didn't behave like a gap at all. It behaved like a bridge. And that raised a dangerous possibility. What if certain genetic lineages had remained far more stable than expected? Not evolving in the typical sense, but maintaining a kind of hidden continuity across thousands of years? At first, this idea seemed unlikely. Evolution doesn't pause. It doesn't hold traits in perfect form across millennia without change. But the data suggested something close to that. A level of preservation that didn't align with standard expectations. So researchers expanded their scope again. They began looking at other ancient remains from nearby regions, searching for similar patterns. Most of the samples followed known evolutionary paths. Gradual changes. Predictable shifts. Nothing unusual. Except for a few, very few. That showed faint traces of the same anomaly. Not identical. Not as strong. But enough to suggest that this individual was not completely alone. And now the mystery was no longer isolated. Because if multiple individuals shared these traits even weakly, it meant there could have been a population, or at least a lineage, that carried this unusual genetic structure. A lineage that history somehow failed to record. But how could an entire group leave so little trace? That question led researchers into a different direction entirely, one that had less to do with bones and more to do with environment. Because genetics doesn't exist in isolation. It interacts with surroundings. Climate, diet, stress, disease, all of these influence how genes express themselves. And in some cases, they can even affect how traits are passed down. So what if this wasn't just about DNA, but about conditions? What if, under certain environmental circumstances, human biology could produce features that appear modern, even in ancient times? This idea introduced a new layer to the mystery. Because now, the question wasn't just when these traits appeared, but why? Researchers began reconstructing the environment in which this individual lived. Soil samples, pollen analysis, isotope data, all of it pointed to something unusual. The region, during that period, had conditions that were slightly different from surrounding areas. Not dramatically different, but enough to influence diet, health, and possibly development. It was a subtle shift. But sometimes, subtle shifts are enough. And yet, even this didn't fully explain the precision of the genetic matches. Because environmental influence can shape features. It can guide development. But it doesn't rewrite DNA at such a deep level. It doesn't create sequences that align so closely with people thousands of years in the future. So the investigation returned to the data. And that's when the most controversial idea began to surface, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility that refused to disappear. What if this wasn't just a case of early evolution, or environmental influence, or even genetic stability? What if it was something more complex? Something like genetic reintroduction. The concept is difficult, but not impossible. In modern science, we already understand that genes can move across populations through migration, interbreeding, and even rare events that bring distant lineages back into contact. Over long periods, traits can disappear and then reappear when conditions allow. But what if that process is more structured than we think? What if certain genetic patterns are not randomly lost? but persist quietly, moving through time in ways we haven't fully mapped yet? This would mean that the modern features we see today might not be entirely new developments. They could be re-emergences. Echoes of traits that existed before, faded, and then returned. And if that's true, then this ancient individual wasn't ahead of their time. They were part of a pattern. A pattern that connects past and present in a way that doesn't follow a straight line. I kept thinking about that. Because it changes how you see history. Not as a timeline, but as something more fluid. More layered. Where certain things don't just disappear, they wait. Imagine that for a moment. Traits moving through generations like hidden signals. Sometimes visible, sometimes not. Until suddenly, in one individual, everything aligns, and the past becomes visible again. That's what this discovery suggests. But even now, nothing is fully confirmed. There are still gaps. Still uncertainties. The DNA data is strong, but interpretation is complex. The environmental evidence is compelling, but not definitive. And the theories, while believable, don't fully resolve the mystery. Which brings us to the real question. Why does this matter? Because this isn't just about one skeleton. It's about how we understand ourselves. If human history is more interconnected than we think, if traits can move across time in unexpected ways, then the story of who we are is not as simple as past leads to present. It's something deeper. A continuous system where past and present are always influencing each other. Where identity is not just inherited, but rediscovered. And maybe that's why discoveries like this feel so unsettling. Because they don't just challenge history. They challenge the idea that we fully understand where we come from. And perhaps, we don't. If you found this story interesting, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because sometimes, the most important part of a mystery is the question you ask next.